I'm trying to wrap up some of the main characteristics of stakeholder involvement and transparency in the context of GRACE, given the fact that these aspects have been quite important, not only the call, but also then later on in implementing the project. So, based on that, I will try to draw a few lessons and make a few observations and present them to you, hopefully to trigger some questions and comments. So what were the main characteristics actually and particular feature of the stakeholder engagement approach in the context of GRACE? You already saw the slide. Actually, a particular feature is upstream engagement. So stakeholder engagement did not focus only at the level of the results, on the results and conclusions, but also we subjected our plans to a stakeholder review and to a discussion step with stakeholders, and as has been illustrated, stakeholders could influence that, what we are doing actually. Another feature is actually that it was an open consultation. Everyone actually could participate. On top of that, there are a few other characteristics actually. One, that we actually had several engagement options, partly in parallel. So it was the face-to-face, the potential for face-to-face discussions in the workshops. Linked to that, and partly replacing that, we had written consultations for those who could not travel for whatever constraints, money, time. We were applying questionnaire and phone interviews, and we're still doing so to get feedback on the engagement process itself. And we do have, as already mentioned, the journal discussion forum. So a number of different engagement options in order to elicit stakeholder feedback and have discussions with them. In terms of transparency, we have tried to be as transparent as possible in terms of stakeholder consultation documents. So we're putting our plans and our results into draft documents and subjected them to a stakeholder review. We even provided raw data in the case of the feeding studies, and the asterisk, just to explain the asterisk here on this slide, is actually, in this case, we had the restriction for that only those who did actually sign a non-disclosure agreement could actually access this raw data. We were trying to be extremely comprehensive and transparent what kind of stakeholder comments we did receive. So we urged our team to respond actually to each single stakeholder comment and also to indicate how it did shape the process in GRACE. We will have, most of the papers that we will have are open access papers, so a number of them are already available. We were also trying to be transparent on the process and on the researchers involved. Moreover, we took considerable efforts to make sure that each stakeholder can actually track how his or her comments are being dealt with in the project. So I've shown you examples with these tables. So you can, and anybody who participated in our stakeholder consultations can verify what happened to his or her comments. Yes, and then we try to be as accurate as possible in our documentation. So stakeholders, after each consultation, the reports were sent to stakeholders for comments, as we were mainly aiming as an utmost clarity in our reports. So in each case, stakeholder could review the report, and this will also happen with the last two consultations that we had in October this year. So in order to reflect more generally on the stakeholder engagement, I will do things. First, I will try to answer the questions whether we met our objectives. just to remind you, we had two objectives. One is to inform and fine-tune the research process, and the other is to enhance the relevance from a broader societal perspective. As regards the first aim, inform and fine-tune the research project, I think the previous presentations have illustrated that to a certain extent we can say yes, it worked out. The stakeholder inputs did inform, in fact, the research process and shaped it in a certain way. And this can be tracked by in our stakeholder consultation reports and by looking at the examples to which reference was given during the day. Still, we have to acknowledge that there are all kinds of constraints, in particular constraints in time of resources and contractual obligations. So a EU framework program is a relatively strict process which allows just for limited flexibility for adopting stakeholder comments. There is another issue that came up in the course of the consultations is the observation that, well, we receive all kinds of inputs during these 3.5 years. Some of them has been perceived as more technical, and others have been perceived as being more politically, at least politically motivated. And there was this kind of unclear, some of us were unclear how to deal with such inputs that are more on the political side. And on top of that, when science is not talking with one tongue, I mean, science can be sometimes diverse, and so we have also within science some divergent views. How to tackle that? With respect to the aim 2, to enhance the relevance from a broader societal perspective, we have to admit that this is an aim that's quite difficult to say something, particularly at this point in time. And whatever we would actually, however we would like to assess whether we have met this aim, it will definitely depend on the precise meaning of relevance. We will probably know more about that once we have completed our feedback exercise. So some of you have already been contacted for phone interviews. Some of you have also already completed questionnaires. So we are a bit under pressure. We did not yet finish that data gathering, but we will have a better idea about that once we have finished that, but still it will be limited what we can tell. What we can tell so far is a kind of, well, we can identify a kind of tendency, and that's actually that according to these preliminary data, actually this engagement approach helped us in better contextualizing what we are doing in terms of input that we are receiving into the research process, but also in terms of contextualizing the findings, so that we actually could understand actually how others are perceiving, interpreting the data that we're generating, and how others are actually, how stakeholders are perceiving and contextualizing also conclusions, for example, recommendations. Given the fact that this was a very long experience, and some of you actually were actually following us over, well, more than 3 years now, what actually many of you and of team members actually sensed is that there was this element of trust that was somehow increasing, like a miracle. Not clear, it's an atmospheric issue. It's not, you cannot really objectively measure that, but this is something that we heard in our feedback, exercise from quite a lot of people. So, and this was also partly also reflected in the way the discussion started and how it's then was developing over time in a very constructive way. And also the awareness was definitely something that was increased by these approach. So based on what we have done and our observations, let me start differently. Linked to what I've just said, I will now make a few observations and draw some preliminary lessons. And these are linked to the feedback data we have received so far. And let me start with one observation. It has already been mentioned before that actually what GRACE has been doing in terms of stakeholder engagement and transparency, it's not what's being usually done. It's going beyond that. You probably already had also heard some people mentioning that this was a huge effort. So, and over the time actually, so the notion developed as actually, in a way, we are pushing that entire endeavor to the limits in terms of transparency and also in terms of stakeholder engagement. So we are really pushing that to what can possibly be done. And this observation is probably a starting point for a number of lessons that I would like to briefly share with you. I've compiled them here on this slide, but I'm not reading out this slide. I am just going step through each single step. Let me start with the workload. It was a tremendous workload for actually everybody, inside GRACE and also among stakeholders. We had 5 large workshops, 8 written consultation. We had plenty of consultation documents. And overall, we received more than 1,000 written comments. So it's exceeding your number by far, actually, that you provided before. So this was resulted from a recent inventory. So we had a total of 10 stakeholder consultation documents that are available, will eventually be available at the GRACE website. At the time being, there are 8 the stakeholder consultation reports. Actually, virtually everyone in the team was engaged, and it had a considerable impact on all work packages. So actually, the fact that we all need to come together in doing these consultations, preparing documents and reflecting on the results, collectively reflecting on the results, actually meant that actually we need to coordinate our work streams that were quite diverse. So that was a tremendous coordination effort and also a tremendous effort for the partners to prepare drafts that can be understood, comprehend by stakeholders, and then to actually reflect on the comments. And not to least to mention the stakeholder efforts actually. Given the number of workshops and consultations and the comprehensiveness of the documents, it's an enormous amount of work that was actually went into that endeavor. So the workload is one particular feature where we felt actually cannot go really further than that. Another issue is the issue of openness versus continuity. We decided deliberately to be non-selective. So we decided to open up the consultation process to everyone who would like to come around, who has an interest in that. So anyone could join at any point in time. But there is a disadvantage here at that point. Actually, we do have, as we could also see in our over time, is that stakeholder participants differed, of course, across the various steps. And this is, in fact, a problem because, given the complexity of the issues and also the various steps, actually, that people are benefiting from being familiar from the various steps, then a change in the participation made it difficult for new participants to really catch up and follow what's going on. So what we had actually, but on top of this changing participation pattern, we also had in both work streams a core group that was following the entire process from the start onwards. So in a way you can say it's a kind of combination of the small group, the small group stakeholder advisory type approach and an open access, an open consultation, because the small group actually stayed with us and was quite active. Another issue that's interesting was the transparency that we are policy, so to say, transparency policy that we're embarking on versus the rules and constraints of science in the making. What we saw in the feedback that the transparency approach that we applied actually was highly appreciated by stakeholders, almost all actually. It has definitive advantages. It probably does not necessarily add something to, automatically add something to the science, and, but it can eventually prevent criticism, for example, from a project point of view. But also, so it's an advantage. But it can also lead, and in fact it does lead, to a much more complex process. So the transparency rules, in the same way as the stakeholder engagement, has a strong influence on the way we have been developing our research process, and we have been moving across the steps. Another issue is that here there is a mismatch with the requirements, for example, of scientific publishing, because editors of scientific journals do not allow pre-publication of data and results. So this is a constraint. So we're not easily allowed to share with you broadly or our results, for example, or conclusions, or put them on the website. Okay, this would really conflict with these requirements of scientific publishing. And essentially, this is a scientific project, and people who are working in the project need to actually pursue this publishing as well. So, and another issue actually that also came up frequently is that, okay, what we actually have been doing across these 3 years is actually, we have been kind of conducting a scientific research project. And in the course of that project, so the knowledge base gradually improved, the conclusions became clearer, the results, the interpretation became more robust. So it's in that process, we took at certain point in time, we provided to our stakeholders a snapshot at what stage we have arrived. And that stage is probably not the most robust one. It was probably considered by some as a more vulnerable one, with very preliminary results, with preliminary interpretations, which is open to misinterpretation and criticism, of course. So it's actually, there is some hesitation among scientists to share this kind of preliminary results with a broader group of stakeholders. Okay, thank you. Another aspect is comprehensiveness and accuracy versus information overload. So we're aiming from the outset to have very comprehensive and accurate documentation of the entire consultation procedures, including all the comments and the responses. This was highly appreciated by our stakeholders and also by partners. On the other hand, it became evident that given the enormous amount of information that we actually put into the public domain, it becomes simply impossible for our stakeholders to really double check whether this has been done and dealt with in an accurate way, double check what happened to their comments. So what we saw so far, only members of the core group actually did so, but more broadly, it was probably too much to assume that stakeholders will really go through that comments. It's still available out there, and in that respect, actually, it's open to further review and reflection, but it's probably was really overloading also our stakeholders. Inclusiveness versus independence. Inclusiveness was highly appreciated, in particular upstream engagement, because this is a distinct feature of GRACE, which is not that frequently happening in other mainly natural scientific projects. But there were also remarks and observation that, well, if we let our stakeholders engage with us at the point in time when we're planning our research and interpreting our results, isn't there a risk that science is being kind of contaminated by policy, by politics even? So in particular, as actually there are interests to keep the science independent and protect science against any influence from the policy side. So how does these come together? Actually, on one hand, inviting stakeholders, motivating them to actually engage and to shape the project. On the other hand, stay kind of independent. So this is actually rather a question than actually that I will pose to this, rather than giving a clue here. And probably 2 more slides. Flexibility. This has already been mentioned. So a normal research project normal natural scientific research project does not allow the flexibility that would be needed to fully appreciate what could be achieved in an upstream engagement step. So if we would have been much more flexible, I think what would have been done in GRACE would have been different. So we were actually caught. We had our contractual obligations, our budgetary, and particularly the time limitations that greatly limited the flexibility and were important to what extent we could take aboard stakeholder comments. So with that in mind, I'm trying to formulate a few conclusions, actually, in terms of preliminary lessons that one could take based on that experience after having gone through that 3.5-year intensive stakeholder consultation and transparency experience. And that in a way, actually, this was can also be considered a social experiment. So we're trying to push that to the limit, makes visible what it means to really try to be very transparent, to engage, to be very inclusive. These are all notions that are being highlighted now, in particular in the context of Horizon 2020, in the context of RI, and I believe we will talk about more about this issue tomorrow. So what would actually be needed is, from the side of the project funding, is we need more actually flexibility in terms of time and resources and project design if you would like to engage more closely with stakeholder in research. We would need resources to allow stakeholder to follow up a process, to participate in such a process. So it's not clear-cut that stakeholders can always participate based on their own resources. So it has already been mentioned today, for example, money for traveling. But probably beyond that, even might think beyond that, it might also be money that can be spent on time. And what we eventually would need actually is more of this kind of experiences in order to eventually gain a better understanding of the various options of corporate governance of research projects that are possible and how, to what extent these options could add something. Thank you.